I now give the floor to Her Excellency Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, President of Croatia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, I congratulate Japan for assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of December. And of course, I would like to welcome Judges Ajus and Meron and Prosecutor Brammertz, present here today. Mr. President, 24 years ago, Croatia was one of the states which strongly advocated for the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the so-called ICTY. Its creation lifted the hopes of thousands of Croatians suffering at the hands of a merciless aggressor. Croatia looked to the ICTY to shield its citizens from grave breaches of international humanitarian law and to punish perpetrators and their sponsors. Croatia shares assessments that the ICTY greatly lived up to the expectations of the international community, having played an important role in the fight against the culture of impunity, and represented an instrument in ensuring accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Equally important is the tribunal's role in giving voice to over 100,000 victims of horrific crimes. The tribunal has demonstrated that crimes will not go unpunished and that the international community has found a means through which it can and must react. This is confirmed by the fact that following the establishment of the ICTY, the international community established other ad hoc tribunals and the International Criminal Court, taking into account its experience with the ICTY, its best practices, as well as its shortcomings. Mr. President, Excellencies, a quarter of a century later, as the tribunal closes its door, we assess its work and legacy against its expected role in securing justice for victims of all war crimes committed in the territory of the former Yugoslavia, paving the path to reconciliation and putting the troubled past behind. Allow me at this point to express my deepest respect for all the victims of crimes committed on all sides, and especially extend my heartfelt condolences to the families of all those who perished or remain missing. In the overall assessment of the work of the tribunal, we have to distinguish between legal assessment of its work and political connotations attached. Here, I can speak only for Croatia. When we look at the ICTY's record in regard to bringing to justice perpetrators of war crimes committed during the onslaught on Croatia, we can be fairly satisfied with its legacy. Let me, as an example, highlight the Martic and Babic case, where the tribunal established the existence of a joint criminal enterprise to expel the Croat population from occupied Croatian territory in order to create a greater Serbia. I also note that two so-called Yugoslav People's Army officers responsible for the unimaginable atrocities at Ovčara, where over 260 Croatian prisoners, mostly wounded, were executed by Serbian forces and buried in a mass grave, were convicted and sentenced. One of them has since died in prison, and the other one has been released early. In the Strugar case, the ICTY convicted yet another Yugoslav People's Army officer for attacks on the civilian population of Dubrovnik and the destruction and willful damage to a UNESCO-protected heritage site. On the other hand, last month, Croatia marked another mournful anniversary of the tragedies and atrocities of the war in the autumn of 1991. Besieged for 3 long months and leveled to the ground, the city of Vukovar and its inhabitants suffered a fate unseen in Europe since World War II. Nearly 1,000 white crosses at the Vukovar cemetery stand today as a reminder of the massacre and for the victims exhumed from mass graves in and around the city. They also stand for 86 children killed during the siege of Vukovar, the youngest being a 6-month-old infant. In Croatia, To borrow the words of ICJ Judge Cancado Trinidade, there was an onslaught, not exactly war. Regrettably, for the horror of the 3-month siege of Vukovar, the ICTY did not charge anyone. While the judgment in the trial of Ratko Mladić brought a degree of relief to the families of his many victims of the genocide in Srebrenica, here I remind again that it was in Croatia where, in 1991, he began his infamous warpath, which he later continued in neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina. Hundreds of his victims in Croatia, in Škabrnja and Nadin, to name just a few infamous examples, never saw him stand trial for those crimes. What is more, they were never even included in his indictment. As some of these most horrific crimes occurred in November 1991, they were commemorated in Croatia only a few days before the final judgments rendered by the ICTY, thus creating an emotionally highly sensitive setting. Mr. President, sharing some critical assessments about the ICTY does not diminish our support for the work of this tribunal. As in all justice systems in the world, there are deficits. I note that the ICTY prosecutor himself has in the past publicly stated that in some cases that resulted in acquittals of the defendants, he respects the judgments of the judges, but fundamentally disagrees with them. Similarly, Croatia fully supports the work of the ICTY and respects all of its judgments, even if it may on occasion express its disagreement with certain aspects of the tribunal's work. It has to be said in the final analysis that in more than 10,000 days of its duration, the ICTY spent too much time on procedural and status-related matters and not enough on providing the victims with a true sense of justice. We have stated in this chamber on many occasions that justice delayed is justice denied. On far too many occasions, justice came too late or not at all. It has to be underlined that a fair trial and the due process of law in front of the ICTY depended on the interaction of responsible work of the Office of the Prosecutor, Defense Counsel, and judges. Furthermore, one of the results of the protracted work of the tribunal, achievements in putting the focus on the future and reconciliation, were often set back with particular judgments that provoked opposing interpretations, not allowing for the sands of time to settle over the troubled history of the area. Lastly, the mastermind of the greater Serbian project that brought on the tragedy that hit the former Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milošević, evaded the final legal judgment. This remains a gaping hole in the tribunal's legacy. Mr. President, Excellencies, the tribunal was not established to determine the legitimacy and justification of wars, but rather whether certain individuals acted in accordance with the laws of war, in accordance with international humanitarian and criminal law. Therefore, this tribunal was not a court dealing with the legitimacy of war, but with the criminal responsibility of individuals during the course of war. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the tribunal judged individuals, the quagmire of political connotations and individual judgments, legal and political consequences that resulted and that will result from these judgments, including the works of this tribunal as a whole, is unavoidable. However, throughout its work, the ICTY did contribute to the realization that crimes were committed during the war by all sides in the conflict, and that these findings facilitated the process of accountability. It is not easy to find strength to admit that some of your own compatriots have committed crimes and that they should be held accountable for them. We face that truth in Croatia and expect nothing less from others. However, there is a difference between dealing out individual responsibility and collective guilt. In creating the ICTY, the Security Council tasked the tribunal to establish individual criminal responsibility and confine the tribunal to the strict application of existing international humanitarian and criminal law. The ICTY was not to create precedents or legislate international humanitarian and criminal law. Its duty was rather to uphold the highest standards with regard to the interpretation and appropriate application of existing law. The mandate of the ICTY is to establish individual criminal responsibility for committed criminal acts, that is, to prosecute concrete individuals for concrete deals, no more and no less than that. Consequently, we reject interpretations of the ICTY's recent judgment in the Prlić and Altry case, and let me add, overshadowed by the tragic death of General Praljak, that it was Croatian leadership at the time, or the Croatian nation, that were indicted or found guilty in front of the ICTY. The ICTY was dealing with the individual defendants who were before the tribunal and who were parties to the proceedings. Any interpretation of this judgment outside of the legal framework and the absence of explicit findings necessary to establish criminal responsibility of Croatia or its leadership is misleading and erroneous. It is important to stress that the same appeals chamber in July 2016, when rejecting Croatia's amicus curiae request and interpreting the 2013 trial judgment, clearly and unequivocally stated that no explicit findings concerning the participation in a joint criminal enterprise of high Croatian officials were made, that they were neither indicted nor charged in the case, and that they were not found guilty of any crimes. Furthermore, the same appeals chamber confirmed that the tribunal does not have the competency to make findings on state responsibility, and that the findings of the trial chamber in no way constitute findings of responsibility on the part of Croatia. The recent ICTY judgment in the Prlić et Altry case should not be misused to imply collective guilt on the Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to hinder their legitimate political objectives as one of the three constituent peoples in the country. No community there should feel unsettled, and that is unfortunately what we have witnessed these days. Croats must feel secure in the homeland that they share with Bosniaks and Serbs. I appeal to all politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina to think first and foremost of their responsibility for the good of both entities and Bosnia and Herzegovina as a whole. Croatia, as a co-signatory and guarantor of the Dayton Peace Accords, has a special responsibility for the stability of our neighborhood and for the preservation of Croats in their homeland of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will relentlessly advocate for productive dialogue among the constituent peoples and all minorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, thus paving the way for its prosperous future in the European Union. Mr. President, it is a historical fact that Croatia was crucial in the very survival of Bosnia and Herzegovina as an independent state. While a victim of aggression and under threat itself at the time, Croatia for years sheltered hundreds of thousands of refugees from Bosnia and Herzegovina and treated more than 10,000 of its wounded in Croatian hospitals. The overwhelming part of humanitarian and military aid to Bosnia and Herzegovina arrived from or through Croatia. At the same time, Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina were victims of war crimes by the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in particular in central Bosnia. Those crimes still remain unpunished. Ultimately, Croatia played a pivotal role in defeating greater Serbian aggression. Upon the request for aid from Sarajevo, in accordance with our bilateral agreements, Croatia prevented the imminent danger of a repetition of the Srebrenica genocide in Bihać in 1995. The Croatian army, supported by the Croatian Defense Council, and the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina confronted Slobodan Milošević with his inevitable and total military defeat that forced him to the negotiating table, thus ending the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And let me be clear, when we in Croatia speak about the greater Serbian aggression that brought the conflict, destruction of property, and loss of life, We do not in any way attach blame to the Serbian people as a whole, but highlight the sole responsibility of Slobodan Milošević and his regime at the time. Mr. President, in closing, my wish is that we leave the war and all the misfortunes in our neighborhood behind us, that we pay tribute to all the victims, condemn all the crimes, but that we primarily and above all look foremost to the future. With the closing of the tribunal, we continue to bear the responsibility of finding the strength to reconcile all nations and all peoples in our region. Saint Pope John Paul II said, "No peace without justice, no justice without forgiveness." The path of forgiveness, which opens the way of mutual understanding, respect, and trust. Victims of crimes committed on all sides and families of all those who perished or remain missing deserve justice. Some received it in The Hague, many did not. Crimes must be addressed for the benefit of our future. Croatia has done this and will continue to do this and expects this from others. I call upon the other leaders in our neighborhood to ensure that the ICTY's judgments are not misinterpreted, misused, or misconstructed, but rather to view this moment as the beginning of a new period, a period of mutual understanding, respect, and trust. My responsibility is to improve relations with our neighborhood. My responsibility is to focus on the future. I hope that we can all agree that it is not only mine, but our common responsibility. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Grabar-Kitarović for her statement.